Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. High above the ash-choked plains of Mordor, where the very air burns with malice and shadow, the wind carries whispers of an ancient question. It is a question that has haunted the minds of mortals since the first tale was told of the ring-bearer's journey, a question born not of wisdom, but of longing for simple answers in a world where none exist. Why didn't they just fly? The words echo across the Pelennor fields, drift through the halls of Minas Tirith, and rise like smoke above the fires of Mount Doom itself. For in the hearts of those who have heard the tale of Frodo Baggins, there burns a desperate wish that the small hobbit might have been spared his crawling agony through the land of shadow. Surely, they reason, the great eagles, those magnificent lords of wind and storm, could have borne him swift as thought to the cracks of doom. But beneath this innocent question lies a mystery far deeper than the mines of Moria, more perilous than the paths of Cirith Ungol. It is a mystery that touches upon the very foundations of Arda, the laws that govern the clash between light and shadow, and the price that even the mightiest must pay when they dare to meddle in the affairs of fate. Picture, if you will, the scene as it might have been. Great wings cutting through the poisoned air above Barad-dûr, their feathers catching what little light penetrates the perpetual gloom. The eye of Sauron, that terrible lidless gaze, turning skyward with sudden, burning interest. The very heavens themselves trembling as divine will meets the Dark Lord's dominion in a battle that was never meant to be fought. The eagles, those noble children of Manwë, Lord of the Winds, were no mere beasts of burden. They were not creatures to be summoned at the whim of mortal need, no matter how desperate. They were the living embodiment of the sky itself, bearers of a sacred trust that stretched back to the music of creation. Their wings had once carried the light of the two trees, had witnessed the forging of the Silmarils, had seen the very foundations of the world laid bare. And yet, when the fate of Middle-earth hung by the thinnest thread, when a small hobbit stumbled through shadow with the weight of all evil upon his finger, these mighty beings remained absent from the battlefield. Not through cowardice, for they had faced Morgoth himself in the elder days, not through ignorance, for their eyes see far beyond the sight of mortal folk, but through something far more profound, far more terrible in its implications. The sky above Mordor was not empty because no one could fly through it. It was empty because the very attempt would have shattered laws older than the Shire, older than Gondor, older than the race of men itself. In that poisoned air above Mount Doom, the fate of two ages hung in balance, and the eagles knew what mortal hearts refused to accept, that some battles cannot be won by strength, some burdens cannot be lifted by wings, and some journeys must be walked step by agonizing step, else the victory itself becomes meaningless. What if the skies themselves were claimed by the Dark Lord long before Frodo ever began his journey? What if the very act of flight toward Mount Doom would have doomed not just the mission, but the eagles themselves, and through them the last hope of divine grace in a world growing ever darker? The truth lies not in the simple question of flight, but in the far more complex web of power, law, and sacrifice that governs the clash between good and evil. For in the realm of the Ainur, even mercy has its price, and even the mightiest wings must sometimes fold in recognition of a wisdom greater than their own. Before there were Ents walking in Fangorn, before the first light of Erendil's star pierced the darkness, before even the elves awakened beside the waters of Cuiviénen, their sword beings of such majesty that the very sight of them could move mountains to song. These were not the tame eagles of lesser tales, trained to carry messages or hunt for their masters. These were the great eagles, the children of Manwe Sulimo, the elder king, whose breath is the wind itself, and whose voice is the thunder that rolls across the heavens. In the depths of the Silmarillion, where the mightiest tales of the elder days are preserved like jewels in darkness, we find the true lineage of these lords of the sky. Thorondor was their king, the king of eagles, whose wingspan cast shadows across entire valleys, whose talons could rend the iron crown from Morgoth's head. It was he who bore Beren and Luthien from the very gates of Angband, who guarded the hidden realm of Gondolin with his great wings spread wide against the northern winds. But Thorondor and his kindred were not mere creatures of flesh and feather, as mortals in their simplicity might believe. They were Maya, divine spirits clothed in forms that could touch the mortal world while still partaking of the eternal realm. Each beat of their wings was a prayer, each cry from their throats an echo of the music of creation itself. They served not from obligation, but from love, not from command, but from the perfect harmony that exists between servant and master when both are aligned with the will of Eru Ilúvatar. Their purpose was sacred, written into the very foundations of Arda. They were the messengers of the Valar, the eyes of Manwe cast wide across the circles of the world. When darkness gathered in hidden places, when evil stirred in the deep foundations of the earth, it was the eagles who brought word to Valinor. When hope seemed lost and the light of the Silmarils was all but extinguished, it was their wings that carried the flame of courage to hearts grown cold with despair. Yet here lies the first great truth that mortals struggle to comprehend. The eagles were watchers, not warriors. Their strength was given not for conquest, but for witness. They could carry word swifter than the wind, could bear aid to those who called upon the Valar in their extremity, could pluck the desperate from the very jaws of death, but they could not, would not, assume the burden of deciding fate itself. In the elder days, when Eärendil sailed his shining ship Vingilo through the shadows of the sky, it was the eagles who guided him to the hidden shores of Valinor. But they did not make his choice for him, they merely made it possible for him to choose. When Fingolfin rode alone to the gates of Angband to challenge Morgoth himself, the eagles witnessed his heroic folly, but did not intervene to prevent it. For they understood, as mortals often do not, that heroism without choice is no heroism at all. This divine restraint, this careful balance between power and wisdom, ran like a golden thread through all their deeds. When Turin Turambar walked his dark path to doom, when Húrin was bound upon Thangorodrim to witness the curse upon his children, when the great kingdoms of Beleriand fell one by one into shadow. Through all these tragedies, the eagles watched and wept, but did not presume to alter the course of fate by force. For they had learned, through ages beyond count, that there are some gifts which lose all meaning if they are simply given, some victories that become defeats if they are too easily won. The music of creation had woven into the very fabric of existence a law more fundamental than gravity, more binding than the foundations of the mountains, that the children of Ilúvatar, elves and men and all our kindred, must be free to choose their own path, even if that path led through shadow and flame. When the eagles rescued Thorin Oakenshield and his company from the Warg Riders, they did so because the dwarves had already chosen their course and proven their courage. When they bore Gandalf from the pinnacle of Orthanc, it was because the wizard had already sacrificed himself in the service of the greater good. In each case, their intervention came not as a replacement for mortal will, but as its reward. And so, when the fate of the Third Age hung upon the shoulders of a small hobbit from the Shire, the eagles faced a choice more terrible than any they had confronted since the elder days. For here was power beyond the dreams of Morgoth himself, concentrated in a simple golden band. Here was corruption so absolute that it could twist even the noblest heart to evil. Here was a burden that could break the will of the mightiest Maiar. and had already claimed one of their own kind. They could fly over shadow and fire, but not over fate. For in the great design of Eru Ilúvatar, some songs must be sung by the smallest voices, and some burdens carried by the weakest hands, else the music itself becomes a lie. From the highest peak of Barad-dûr, the dark tower that pierced the very sky, like a needle of malice, the eye of Sauron swept the horizons with a gaze that could burn stone and wither the hearts of kings. This was no mere metaphor born of poetic fancy, no simple turn of phrase to describe the Dark Lord's vigilance. The eye was real, a manifestation of will so absolute, so consuming, that it had taken physical form in the world, a lidless orb of fire that never slept, never wavered, never showed mercy to any living thing that dared cross its sight. But the true horror of Sauron's dominion lay not merely in his ability to see, but in his mastery of the element that had once belonged to Manwë alone. For the Dark Lord, in his corruption, had learned to claim the very air, self, as his domain. The skies above Mordor were not empty spaces through which heroes might fly unnoticed. They were a battleground where every breath of wind served the enemy, where every cloud was eyes, where every shadow cast by wing or pinion would be seen and marked and destroyed. Consider the vast machinery of watchers that Sauron had erected in the latter days of the Third Age. Upon every peak that commanded a view of the sky, the Dark Lord had raised towers of black stone, each one crewed by servants whose only purpose was to scan the heavens for signs of intrusion. The Nazgûl themselves rode the high air upon their fell beasts, those creatures of shadow and malice whose wings could blot out the stars. From Cirith Ungol to the Morannon, from the Ash Mountains to the borders of Nûrn, a network of watchers maintained their eternal vigil. The very air above Mordor had become a weapon in Sauron's hands. The winds that blew from Mount Doom carried not merely the stench of sulphur and ash, but something far more sinister, the concentrated will of the Dark Lord himself, reaching out to crush any creature not aligned with his purpose. Storm clouds gathered at his command, lightning struck where his gaze directed it, and the sky itself seemed to press down upon the earth with the weight of his malice. Imagine, if you can bear it, the fate that would have awaited any eagle brave enough to attempt that impossible flight, the great wings beating against air that fought them with every stroke, each breath drawn from an atmosphere thick with poison and hate. The eye turning skyward with sudden, terrible interest, its fiery gaze focusing upon the intruder with all the concentrated malevolence of ages. The fell beasts rising from their roosts like living shadows, their piercing cries echoing across the desolate landscape as they closed in for the kill. For this was Sauron's greatest strategic triumph in the War of the Ring, not merely the gathering of vast armies or the forging of weapons of war, but the claiming of the sky itself as his exclusive domain. He had learned from the elder days, when Thorondor's eagles had struck at Morgoth from above, when the great birds had carried news and aid across the vast battlefields of Beleriand. Never again would the sky be used against him. Never again would wings of hope darken his dominion. The watchtowers of Mordor were more than mere fortifications. They were the nodes of a vast network of perception that turned the entire realm into a single, oversized trap. Each tower was connected to its neighbors by lines of sight carefully calculated to leave no gap uncovered, no angle of approach unguarded. The guards who manned these positions were chosen not for their strength in battle, but for their keenness of vision, their ability to spot movement against the distant sky even in the deepest darkness. And beyond even these physical defenses lay something more terrible still, the corruption of the very element of air itself. In the same way that Sauron had poisoned the waters of Mordor and turned the earth itself into a wasteland of ash and slag, so too had he bent the winds to his will. The air above his realm was no longer neutral ground where creatures might fly according to their nature. It had become an extension of his consciousness, as much a part of him as his physical form. To enter that airspace uninvited was not merely dangerous, it was an act of war against the very essence of the Dark Lord himself. The eagles with their divine sight could perceive this corruption more clearly than any mortal being. They could see how the natural currents of the wind had been twisted into unnatural patterns, how the very molecules of air had been infused with malice and hatred. To fly through such an atmosphere would be like swimming through liquid poison, each wing beat an agony, each breath a step closer to madness and death. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the knowledge that Sauron's dominion over the sky was not merely defensive, but actively predatory. The eye did not simply watch, it hunted. The Dark Lord had learned to use his mastery of the air itself as a weapon, calling down storms upon his enemies, striking them with lightning, suffocating them with poisonous winds. The very atmosphere had become his tool of war, and any creature that dared to challenge him in his own element would face not merely physical destruction, but spiritual annihilation. This was the true reason why no eagle's wing darkened the skies of Mordor during those final, desperate days of the Third Age. It was not fear that kept them away, nor uncertainty about their mission. It was the cold recognition that the element which should have been their natural domain, the pure, free air that had once carried them between earth and heaven, had been corrupted beyond redemption, turned into a weapon against everything they represented. For in the realm of shadow, even the light of the sun was a trespass, and the very act of drawing breath became an act of defiance that demanded immediate and terrible punishment. In the high halls of Valinor, where the light of the two trees once blessed the realm of the Valar with radiance beyond mortal comprehension, there was established from the very beginning of time a law more fundamental than the movement of the stars, more binding than the roots of the mountains. It was a law written not in stone or steel, but in the very fabric of creation itself, that the fate of Arda and all who dwelt upon it must ultimately rest in the hands of the children of Ilúvatar, not in the power of their guardians. This was the great lesson learned in blood and sorrow during the Elder Days, when the Valar had tried to shield the newly awakened elves from the darkness of Morgoth by bringing them across the sea to the Blessed Realm. For a time, it seemed that all would be well, that evil could be contained in the distant darkness, while the children of light dwelt in safety and joy beneath the eternal glow of Laurelin and Telperion. But the music of creation, which encompasses all possibilities within its great theme, had woven into its harmonies a truth that even the Valar had been slow to understand: that perfect safety is the enemy of growth, that unchallenged virtue is no virtue at all, and that even the most loving protection becomes a prison if it prevents the protected from making their own choices. The first great tragedy came when Feanor, mightiest of all the Eldar, allowed pride and possessiveness to corrupt his noble heart. The Silmarils, those holy jewels that captured the light of the trees themselves, became the focus of an obsession that would ultimately tear the world apart. But the deeper tragedy lay in the recognition that even in Valinor, even under the direct protection of the Valar themselves, the children of Ilúvatar remained free to choose darkness over light, hatred over love, destruction over creation. When Morgoth stole the Silmarils and fled to Middle-earth, when Feanor and his sons swore their terrible oath and followed in pursuit, the Valar faced a choice that would echo through all the ages to come. They could intervene directly, could unleash their full power to stop the kinslaying at Alqualondë, could force the rebellious Noldor to remain in the Blessed Realm where they would be safe from the corruption of the world. Or they could allow the children of Ilúvatar to choose their own path, even if that path led through sorrow and death. They chose Frodo over safety, and the price was beyond calculation. The long wars of Beleriand, the fall of the great kingdoms, the death of kings and the sorrow of entire peoples, all of this might have been prevented by a single act of divine intervention. But the Valar had learned that love without freedom is not love at all, and that victory achieved by removing all possibility of choice is no victory worth having. When at last the pride of Númenor grew so great that the men of that blessed isle dared to sail against Valinor itself, seeking to claim immortality by force, the Valar faced their final test. Here was corruption that threatened the very foundations of the world, rebellion that could unravel the music of creation itself. Yet even then, even in the face of such ultimate defiance, they held back their hand until the last possible moment. Only when Ar-Pharazôn's fleet actually touched the shores of the Undying Lands did they act, and then with such reluctance that they laid down their own guardianship of the world, rather than rule it by force. The straight road was removed from the circles of the world. Valinor was taken out of the physical realm entirely, and the Valar withdrew from direct involvement in mortal affairs. This was not retreat, but the ultimate act of love. The recognition that their children had grown beyond the need for constant protection and must be free to shape their own destiny, even if that destiny led through darkness. And so, when the One Ring was forged and the shadow of Sauron fell across Middle-earth, the great eagles found themselves bound by this ancient law. They were Maiar, servants of Manwë, carrying within their noble hearts the same divine nature that had once walked openly among mortals in the elder days. But they were also bound by the wisdom learned through ages of sorrow, that there are some battles which lose all meaning if they are won by divine intervention, some choices which become meaningless if they are made by others on behalf of those who should choose for themselves. The eagles could rescue Gandalf from Orthanc because the wizard had already chosen to resist Saruman and accept whatever fate that choice might bring. They could bear Thorin and his company from the Warg Riders because the dwarves had already committed themselves to their quest despite its dangers. But they could not carry Frodo to Mount Doom, because to do so would be to remove from the Hobbit the very choice that gave his sacrifice meaning. For if the eagles had simply flown the ring-bearer to his destination, where would be the test of will that proved Middle-earth worthy of salvation? Where would be the demonstration that even the smallest and weakest of beings could resist the ultimate corruption when their hearts were pure? Where would be the proof that love and loyalty could triumph over power and domination, not through strength of arms, but through strength of spirit? More than this, the divine law that bound the eagles was not merely about preserving free will, but about preventing the very corruption that had destroyed Númenor. Power, even power used with the best of intentions, has a way of justifying itself, of finding reasons why its use should be expanded, why those who wield it should make ever more decisions on behalf of those they protect. The eagles knew, with the terrible clarity of divine sight, that if they bent their sacred mission even slightly toward direct intervention in mortal affairs, they would begin the same slide toward tyranny that had claimed so many of their kind. If the eagles had carried the ring to Mordor, they might have saved Frodo's body, but they would have doomed his soul, and with it, the souls of all who dwelt in Middle-earth. For they would have proven that when the test came, when everything hung in the balance, the children of Ilúvatar were not strong enough to save themselves and must be saved by their betters. The Valar themselves would have fallen into sin, becoming rulers rather than guardians, masters rather than servants of the music of creation. And in that moment, Sauron would have achieved his ultimate victory, not through conquest, but through corruption, by turning even the forces of good into instruments of domination. There exists in the deep archives of Gondor a fragment of ancient lore written in the flowing script of the Númenóreans in the days when their wisdom was still untainted by pride. It speaks of a terrible truth that few dare to contemplate. that the One Ring of Power was not merely a tool of domination over the races of Middle-earth, but a corruption so absolute, so fundamentally opposed to the nature of free will itself, that it could twist even the purest hearts to darkness. And among those pure hearts, none burned brighter than those of the great eagles, the beloved servants of Manwë, whose nobility had remained unstained through all the long ages of the world. But purity, as the wise know, is not armor against corruption. It is often the very quality that makes corruption most devastating when it finally takes hold. For the ring did not work by overwhelming its victims with obvious evil, but by speaking to the deepest virtues within their hearts and slowly, subtly turning those virtues into instruments of domination. It whispered to the courageous of the good they could do, if only they had more power to enforce their will. It sang to the compassionate of the suffering they could prevent, if only they had the authority to compel obedience. It promised the wise that with its aid, they could finally impose perfect order upon a chaotic world. Consider how easily the ring might have spoken to the heart of one of Manwë's eagles. These beings had spent millennia watching the suffering of Middle-earth from above, seeing the endless cycles of war and darkness, seeing the fall of great kingdoms and the sorrow of countless innocents. They had the power to soar above all earthly conflict, to see the great patterns of history spread out below them like a map. Who better to judge what was best for the small folk who dwelt in ignorance below? Who more qualified to make the hard choices that mortals seemed incapable of making for themselves? The ring would not have needed to corrupt them with visions of personal glory or material wealth. It would have spoken instead to their genuine love for the children of Ilúvatar, their sincere desire to protect and guide them. "Look how they suffer," it would have whispered. "Look how they war against each other, how they destroy the beauty of the world through their ignorance and greed. With my power, you could end all of this. You could bring peace to Middle-earth forever. You could ensure that no child ever again goes hungry, no innocent ever again dies in war, no darkness ever again rises to threaten the light." And slowly, so slowly that they might not even notice it happening, the eagles would begin to rationalize ever greater interventions in mortal affairs. They would start by preventing wars, ending conflicts before they could begin by removing the leaders who might start them. They would continue by restructuring the governments of men and elves and dwarves to make them more efficient, more just, more capable of maintaining the peace. They would end by ruling over all the free peoples as benevolent but absolute tyrants, convinced in their own minds that they were serving the greater good, even as they crushed every vestige of the freedom that made their subjects truly alive. This was not mere speculation, but a pattern written in the very history of Arda itself. Sauron had not begun as a Dark Lord, but as a servant of Ol the Smith, devoted to bringing order and perfection to the world. His fall began not with a sudden turn to evil, but with the gradual conviction that he knew better than others what was good for them. The Nazgûl had not been born monsters, but kings and sorcerers who had genuinely sought to use their power for the betterment of their people. Even Saruman the White, chief of the Istari, had fallen through the same path, believing that his wisdom gave him the right to impose his will upon others for their own good. The eagles, with their divine nature and their lofty perspective, would have been even more vulnerable to this particular form of corruption. They would not have seen themselves as becoming tyrants, but as fulfilling their highest calling, the protection and guidance of all who dwelt beneath the sky. The ring would have convinced them that their intervention was not a violation of free will, but its ultimate expression, since they would be creating conditions under which mortals could finally choose truly freely, without the distortions of fear, want, or ignorance. But the most terrifying aspect of this potential corruption would have been its irreversibility. Unlike mortals, who might eventually recognize their error and repent of their misdeeds, the eagles possessed power sufficient to enforce their will upon the entire world. Once they had convinced themselves that their dominion was just and necessary, there would be no force in Middle-earth capable of opposing them, no higher authority to which their victims might appeal. Even the Valar would be powerless to intervene without breaking their own law against direct rule over the children of Ilúvatar. The ring would have given the eagles not merely the power to conquer, but the power to reshape the very nature of their subjects, to eliminate the capacity for rebellion or even discontent. They could have created a world where every being lived in perfect contentment under their rule, never knowing that they had lost their freedom because they would no longer possess the ability to conceive of freedom as a possibility. It would have been the ultimate expression of the ring's power, not merely to dominate, but to make domination seem like love, oppression seem like protection, slavery seem like salvation. This was why the eagles could not come near the ring, why they avoided even the possibility of encountering it during its journey to Mount Doom. They knew themselves too well, understood too clearly the nobility of their own hearts, and how easily that nobility could be turned into a weapon against everything they truly loved. They had seen what happened to Sauron, had witnessed the fall of Saruman, had heard the tales of the Nazgûl, who had once been great kings, and they knew that their own fall would be infinitely more catastrophic, not because they were more evil than these others, but because they were more good, and therefore more capable of doing evil while believing it to be righteousness. Had they flown to Mordor, they might never have come back down, not because they would have been destroyed by Sauron's defenses, but because they would have destroyed themselves, transformed by the ring's influence into something unrecognizable, something that wore their shapes and spoke with their voices, but served an entirely different master. And in their transformation, the last hope of divine grace in Middle-earth would have been extinguished forever. In the grey mists of morning, when the world was young and the first light of Erendil's star had not yet pierced the darkness, Eru Ilúvatar looked upon the music that his children would make and saw within its harmonies a truth that would echo through all the ages of the world. The mightiest themes would not be sung by the greatest voices, the most crucial melodies would not be played by the most skilled musicians, and the fate of all creation would ultimately rest not in the hands of the powerful, but in the choices of the small and seeming, insignificant. This was not mere poetry or hopeful sentiment, but a fundamental law woven into the very structure of existence itself. Again and again, throughout the long history of Arda, when darkness seemed triumphant and hope appeared lost, it was the unexpected heroes who rose to meet the challenge, not in spite of their weakness, but because of it. For weakness, when coupled with courage, becomes a strength that power alone can never achieve. Humility, when joined with determination, becomes an unshakable foundation that pride can never undermine. When the hobbit Frodo Baggins stood in the firelight of Bag End and accepted the burden of the One Ring, he became the living embodiment of this eternal truth. Here was no warrior prince trained from birth in the arts of war, no wizard versed in the deep lore of the ages, no king crowned with authority over vast realms. Here was simply a small creature from a peaceful corner of the world, whose greatest adventures had involved nothing more dangerous than getting lost in the old forest or having unexpected dinner guests. Yet it was precisely this simplicity, this fundamental ordinariness, that made him suitable for a task that would have broken the greatest heroes of the elder days. Feanor, mightiest of all the Eldar, had been consumed by his desire to possess the Silmarils. Isildur, greatest of the kings of men, had failed to destroy the ring when he had the chance. Even Gandalf and Galadriel, wisest of all the wise, dared not touch the ring, lest it corrupt their noble purposes and turn their strength against those they sought to protect. But Frodo possessed something that all these mighty beings lacked: the absence of great ambition. He did not dream of ruling kingdoms or reshaping the world according to his vision of justice. He did not burn with the desire to right all wrongs or impose his will upon the chaos of existence. He wanted only to return to his garden, to his books, to the simple pleasures of a simple life lived in peace. And it was precisely this lack of grand dreams that made him capable of carrying a burden that promised to fulfill every grand dream imaginable. The ring whispered to him, as it whispered to all who bore it, of the good he could do with its power. It showed him visions of the Shire transformed into a paradise, of all the free peoples united under his wise and benevolent rule, of evil banished forever from the circles of the world. But Frodo's heart was too small, too humble, too content with ordinary joys to be tempted by extraordinary power. He knew himself well enough to recognize that he was not wise enough to rule over others, not strong enough to bear the weight of absolute authority, not good enough to trust himself with the power to compel obedience. And so he walked, step by agonizing step, through the desolation of Mordor, carrying not only the ring, but the hopes of all the world upon his shoulders. Every footfall was an act of faith. Every breath drawn in that poisoned air was a declaration that some things are worth suffering for, some causes worth dying for, some victories worth winning, even at the cost of everything that makes life sweet. This was the true mission that had been given to him, not merely to destroy the ring, but to prove that it could be destroyed, that the ultimate power could be willingly relinquished, that love could triumph over domination, not through strength but through sacrifice. His journey was not a failure of imagination or planning on the part of the wise, but the only path that could lead to true victory. For if the ring had been destroyed by force, by the intervention of eagles or armies or the power of the Valar themselves, its destruction would have proven nothing, except that one form of power could overcome another. But when it was destroyed by the choice of the weakest among the free peoples, when a hobbit who could have claimed dominion over all the world instead chose to cast that dominion into the fires of Mount Doom, the victory was complete and eternal. It proved that the children of Ilúvatar possessed within themselves the strength to resist any corruption, to overcome any temptation, to choose good even when evil seemed far more practical and profitable. The eagles understood this truth with the clarity of divine sight. They knew that their intervention, however well-intentioned, would rob the victory of its meaning and the world of its salvation. They could see how the story needed to unfold, how the themes of the great music required this particular melody to be sung by this particular voice. Their restraint was not indifference, but the deepest form of love, the willingness to allow those they cherished to face the ultimate test, knowing that only through facing it could they truly prove themselves worthy of the freedom they fought to preserve. Middle-earth's fate was not to be decided by strength or flight, but by mercy and endurance. The smallest hands were chosen for the greatest burden because only they could resist the temptation of domination. Only they could carry power without being corrupted by it. Only they could achieve victory without becoming that which they fought against. For the flight of the eagles was never meant to save, only to witness salvation and to carry home the wounded when their task was done. When the fires of Mount Doom finally consumed the Ring of Power, when Sauron's voice was lifted up in a great cry of defeat that shook the very foundations of Barad-dûr, when the darkness began to roll back from the lands it had covered like a tide retreating from the shore, only then did the great eagles spread their mighty wings and take to the sky abode their Mordor. They came not as conquerors surveying a battlefield won by their strength, not as saviors arriving to claim credit for a victory they had achieved, but as servants fulfilling the final act of their ancient duty to bring mercy to those who had earned it through their sacrifice. Gwaihir the Wind Lord, greatest of the eagles in the Third Age, led his kindred through air that was already beginning to clear, through skies that no longer burned with the malice of the Dark Lord's will. Below them, the towers of Mordor crumbled into dust, The armies of shadow fled in terror, and the very earth seemed to sigh with relief as the weight of domination was lifted from its shoulders. But the eagles paid no heed to this great spectacle of destruction and liberation. Their keen eyes were focused on a single small figure lying motionless beside the cracks of doom, a hobbit who had given everything he had to give and now lay at the point of death, his task completed, his strength utterly spent. There was a terrible irony in that moment, visible only to those with the sight to perceive it. Throughout all the long months of the War of the Ring, when desperate voices had cried out, asking why the eagles did not simply fly the ring-bearer to his destination, the great birds had remained absent from the battlefield, bound by laws older than the Shire itself. Yet now, when their intervention was no longer needed to determine the fate of the world, when the choice had been made and the victory won, they came swiftly and without hesitation to perform an act of pure mercy. For this had always been their true purpose in the great design of Providence, not to win the war, but to tend to the wounded when the war was over. Not to make the choice, but to honor those who had chosen correctly. Not to bear the burden, but to carry home those who had borne it to the very limits of their endurance and beyond. As Gwaihir descended toward the slopes of Mount Doom, his great wings casting a shadow of protection over the still forms of Frodo and Sam, he embodied in that single gesture the difference between power and authority, between strength and true greatness. He could have flown to Mordor at any time during the preceding months, could have seized the ring and borne it to its destruction through force of wing and talon. But such an act would have been an expression of power, the imposition of will through superior strength. What he did instead was an expression of authority, the freely given service that flows from recognition of worth. He came not because he was compelled to come, not because duty demanded it, not because the laws of the Valar required it, but because love called to love, because mercy recognized merit, because the sight of innocent suffering freely chosen for the sake of others moved his noble heart to action. The rescue itself was simplicity incarnate. Two small bodies, lifted gently in talons that could have rent stone, carried through air that sang with freedom toward shores where healing waited. But the symbolic weight of that simple act was beyond all calculation. It was the final proof that the victory had been real, that the sacrifice had been meaningful, that the choice to walk rather than fly had been vindicated by events. For if the eagles had carried Frodo to Mount Doom, he would have arrived there as a passenger, a burden to be transported, a tool to be used in someone else's plan. But when they carried him away from Mount Doom, he came as a hero returning home, a champion whose deed had earned him the right to rest, a savior whose sacrifice had purchased not only his own salvation, but the salvation of all who dwelt beneath the sky. The difference was subtle, but absolutely crucial. The difference between being acted upon and acting, between being saved and saving, between being the object of someone else's mercy and becoming worthy of mercy through one's own choices. Frodo had entered the Samath Naur as a small creature carrying a burden too great for him to bear alone. He was carried from it as something far greater, a being who had faced the ultimate test of character and emerged victorious, not through strength or wisdom or divine favor, but through the simple determination to do what was right, regardless of the cost. In their flight back toward the lands of the living, Gwaihir and his companions bore more than just two wounded hobbits. They carried the living proof that the age of miracles had not ended, that the music of creation still sang through the choices of the small and seemingly insignificant, that even in a world growing ever darker, the light could still triumph through sacrifice rather than strength. They did not win the war. They came to carry home the wounded, and in that distinction lay the difference between tyranny and freedom, between conquest and salvation, between the domination that destroys and the authority that serves. The wings that had been forbidden to fly in battle were granted the privilege of flying in mercy, and in that final flight, the wisdom of their restraint was vindicated beyond all doubt. And thus the wings of mercy followed where the wings of power had never dared, proving once and for all that there are some victories which can only be won by those who refuse to claim them, some burdens which can only be lifted by those who are willing to bear them, and some journeys which can only be completed by those who walk them step by step, choosing at each moment to continue forward despite the cost. The wind still blows across the peaks of the misty mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow, and the distant memory of songs sung in the elder days when the world was young. In the high places where eagles build their nests and teach their young to ride the currents of the sky, the ancien, that wisdom endures, passed down from generation to generation like a sacred trust that must never be forgotten. For the tale of the eagles and the ring-bearer has become more than history. It has become parable, a teaching story that speaks to truths deeper than the mere facts of what happened in those desperate days at the end of the Third Age. It speaks to the fundamental questions that every thinking being must eventually face. When should power be used, and when should it be withheld? When does helping become harming? When does love become tyranny? When does the desire to protect become the need to control? In the great libraries of Minas Tirith, where the scholars of the Fourth Age labor to preserve the wisdom of the past for the generations yet to come, they have written that the eagle's refusal to fly Frodo to Mount Doom represents the highest expression of wisdom ever achieved by any of the free peoples. For it required a form of courage far rarer than the courage needed to face death in battle. The courage to refrain from action when action seems both possible and necessary. The courage to allow others to face dangers that one could easily prevent. The courage to trust in the ultimate goodness of creation, even when all the evidence seems to point toward disaster. This was not the courage of ignorance, but the courage of perfect knowledge. The eagles knew, with the clarity that comes only to those who have seen the music of creation spread out before them in all its infinite complexity, exactly what would happen if they intervened. They could see the corruption that would follow, the tyranny that would emerge from the best of intentions, the slow but inevitable transformation of protection into domination. They could see how their act of mercy would become an act of violence against the very nature of those they sought to save. And so they chose the harder path, the path of faith rather than force, of trust rather than control, of love rather than possession. They chose to believe that the small hobbit stumbling through the wasteland of Mordor carried within his humble heart a strength greater than all their wings and talons combined. They chose to believe that the music of creation had woven into its theme a harmony that could triumph over discord without needing to silence the voices that sang different songs. Their restraint was their greatest gift to Middle-earth, not the negative gift of what they did not do, but the positive gift of what they made possible by their restraint. By refusing to save Frodo, they allowed him to save himself. By refusing to solve the problem of the ring through force, they allowed it to be solved through choice. By refusing to impose their will upon the course of events, they allowed the will of Eru Ilúvatar to work through the free decisions of his children. This is the lesson that echoes still through the halls of Rivendell and the gardens of Lothlorien, through the taverns of Bree and the libraries of Gondor. It whispers in the voices of parents learning when to guide their children and when to let them find their own way. It speaks in the hearts of rulers, learning the difference between governing and ruling, between serving their people and owning them. It sings in the souls of all who possess power and must daily choose how to use it, or whether to use it at all. The eagles learned what every wise being must eventually learn, that there are some gifts which become curses if they are given too freely, some help which becomes harm if it is offered too readily, some love which becomes hatred if it is expressed through control rather than freedom. They learned that the highest expression of strength is sometimes the willingness to appear weak, that the greatest act of love is sometimes the willingness to allow the beloved to suffer, that the truest victory is sometimes the willingness to accept apparent defeat. And in learning these things, they became something more than mere servants of the valor, more than simple messengers and rescuers. They became teachers whose very restraint taught lessons that no amount of direct intervention could have conveyed. They became examples of wisdom that will endure long after their own age has passed into legend, long after the last of their kind has flown into the west to join their kindred in the blessed realm beyond the circles of the world. The mountain winds carry their lesson still, and will carry it always to any who have the wisdom to listen and the courage to understand. It is a lesson written not in words, but in silence, not in action, but in restraint, not in what they did, but in what they chose not to do when all the world was crying out for them to act. For power unused is not power wasted. It is power perfected, transformed from a tool of domination into an instrument of liberation, from a weapon of war into a gift of peace. And in that transformation lies the ultimate victory, the final triumph, the last and greatest chord in the music of creation itself. The next time you ask why the eagles did not fly to Mordor, remember, they were never meant to carry the burden, only to witness its bearing, and to remind us all that some flights are worth taking, and some flights are worth refusing, and the wisdom to know the difference is the greatest treasure that any winged or wingless being can possess. In the end, that may be the most profound truth of all, that the eagle's greatest flight was the one they never took, and their greatest victory was the one they never won, and their greatest gift to Middle-earth was their willingness to let others write the ending to the greatest story ever told. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.